Today's episode is brought to you by Aura. Stay tuned to learn how you can receive a special trial offer for Aura. Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today, I'm starting a short series responding to a video put out by Mike Winger, in which he reads through an article on the blog site Allocation called 3 Famous Atheists and Their Best Arguments. Now, Mike and I can both agree that it's not a terribly well-written blog, and it makes several mistakes about the arguments that the author's relying on, but Mike's responses are, at the very least, inadequate, so I'm going to go through and give my thoughts on them. Mike's video came from a live stream, and as such is him going off the cuff and unscripted. Because of this, there are a lot of unrelated tangents and unnecessary fluff, as well as him just bragging about all the hours and hours worth of content he's made on specific topics.
Hours and hours and hours of details. It's like 4 hours of content. Video down below that's over 3 hours.
So I cut a lot out of this. The link to the original is in the description, so you can go ahead and watch the whole thing to make sure I'm not unfairly decontextualizing anything, but the original stream was an hour and 23 minutes long, so even after I cut it down, it was still about 35 minutes, and that's a big video to respond to in one go, so this will be a 4-part series broken up into the various arguments that Mike is responding to. Today we're going to be dealing with that whole Christians are atheists about thousands of gods, atheists just go one god further thing that usually gets attributed to Ricky Gervais, but as far as I can tell, it originated with Dawkins and the God Delusion. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to point out that this is more of a rhetorical device than an argument, with the intention seeming to be to encourage an examination of your epistemological justification for your religious beliefs. But a lot of people, both atheist and Christian, misunderstand this. Anyway, that's enough preamble, let's get on to the video! But first, a word from our sponsor, Aura. Do you know how much of your personal data is available for sale on the internet? Even the most careful of users can end up with their personal information being passed between data brokers. Data brokers sell your information to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who may want to target you. Your full name, email address, home address, health records, your relatives, it's all out there. And that's a problem that Aura, the sponsor of today's video, has set out to solve. Aura shows you which data brokers are selling your information and automatically submits opt-out requests for you. Cleaning up your information not only helps reduce the amount of spam you get, but can also protect you from hackers who could use this information to access your social media accounts, bank accounts, or other sensitive information. Aura also does so much more to protect you and your family from online threats that you may not be able to see. With Aura, you'll also get access to their features like antivirus, password management, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more, without having to download several different apps. It's really easy to set up, and best of all, you can get everything at one affordable price. You may have 1 or 2 of these tools already, but not having Aura is like locking the front door, but leaving the back door wide open. Aura is always on, doing the hard work of keeping you safe so that you can focus on other tasks with peace of mind. I value my privacy, and I value yours. You can go to aura.com/vicerhino to start your 2-week trial for free. Stop data brokers from exposing your personal information by going to aura.com/vicerhino to get a 14-day free trial and see how much of your data is being sold. That's www.aura.com/vicedrhino for your 14-day free trial.
Here we go. This is the article. He says, quoting Richard Dawkins from his book, The God Delusion, "We are all atheists about most of the gods that humanity has ever believed in. Some of us just go one god further." Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. So the first argument is this: we're all atheists.
Yeah, so like I said, not really an argument as much as a provocative statement meant to encourage you to examine why you believe what you believe. I don't recall if that's exactly how Dawkins was using it, and honestly, I don't particularly care. But that is my read on it when it's removed from its context, like it usually is, and that does track with how Dawkins usually works. Hell, just look at the title of the damn book it's from, The God Delusion. If you don't think that was intentionally inflammatory, then I honestly don't know what would count towards that for you. Also, just a blanket disclaimer here. I am speaking for myself, not Dawkins and not the author of the blog post. I'm not defending Dawkins or the author of the post. I'm tackling this from my perspective.
Really 2 issues, 2 very different issues that are overlapping in this first argument. We're all atheists. The assertion is, number 1, there is little difference between monotheists and atheists.
Well, no, it's not that there's little or no difference. It's that when you apply your reasons for not believing in other religions, an unbiased application of these reasons will frequently work for whatever religion you do believe in as well.
There's very little difference, right? We just believe in one less God than you. You're practically an atheist. In fact, he even says we're all atheists.
And that's the provocative part of the provocative statement. Many religions demonize atheists to an even greater degree than the followers of competing religions. So to call an adherent of one such religion effectively an atheist serves as a shock. That's not a label they'd ever voluntarily associate with. It likely has some pretty massive stigma in their minds, so the hope in making such a statement is not with the goal of redefining atheism to include people who believe in one God, but to shock those people into deeper thought. Now, whether or not this is actually effective is a matter of debate, and personally this is not a statement that I would generally find useful to make, but to argue about definitions instead of addressing the point that's being made is less useful than the original statement.
The second issue, we'll cover them one at a time. But the second issue is going to be if you have consistent standards. Hey Christian, hey Buddhist, hey whoever you are. If you had consistent standards, then the reasons you have for rejecting other religions would make you reject your own religion.
That's actually the main thrust of the statement rather than the secondary, but basically yes. You stated it in more absolute terms than I would, with a more certain conclusion, but that is the core of it.
So first, let's deal with the first issue. Is it true that Christians just believe in one more God than the atheists?
No. Y'all actually believe in at least 3 more gods than the atheists, with 4 being common. The Trinity, despite apologist protestations to the contrary, is essentially 3 gods. Then you've got your malicious god, Satan. And a good argument could be made that the more than 10,000 saints recognized by the Catholic Church are demigods. But if you ask a typical Christian, they will tell you that they believe in one God. Atheists believe in 0. So to answer your question, 1 is more than 0. So yes, it is true.
And that's a small issue. That's a small thing, right? It's just one less God.
No, that's not it at all. It's not about how big of a deal one God is versus however many other gods might be believed in, or how few gods atheists believe in. All it is a statement that's meant to get you thinking about why you believe in that one God. Not to dismiss that one God because it's just one, and you've already dismissed thousands of others, so what's one more?
Believing in one God literally is the difference between atheism and monotheism.
Thanks, Mike. I never would have figured that out if you hadn't explained it.
So, if that's the whole difference, then how can one say you're basically an atheist when the only defining attribute that keeps you from being an atheist is present in your life?
Like I said earlier, arguing about definitions instead of addressing the point is an incredibly useless endeavor. The point in using the word atheist is purely for shock value, not technical accuracy.
It's just snark and shallow thinking. Not only that, but if you do believe in God, it radically affects your entire worldview. Because atheists who say it's just one less God and act like it's a small thing will also go on to talk about the virtues of atheism and how once they shed themselves of their horrific belief in God, they were freed from it. Well, they obviously think belief in God is a big deal when they say things like that. So how can it all of a sudden not be a big deal?
Literally nobody said that belief in God is no big deal. Not even the poorly written article that you're responding to. You're fighting against a complete straw man, and this isn't even a difficult point from an apologist perspective. All you needed to do was to point out that this doesn't work as an argument because it's not one, and then explain your epistemological justification for believing in Christianity rather than in another religion, and you would have been done. But no, instead you gotta fight against a definition that nobody holds.
It's just snark and shallow thinking.
This line almost short-circuited my brain. A good chunk of what I've been cutting out from Mike's video is him being snarky for no apparent reason. And thinking doesn't get any shallower than accidentally fighting against a straw man of a position when it would have been way easier for him to just directly answer that position.
Now let's deal with the second issue, the street epistemology side. And that is that consistent standards would make you reject all religions. Let me explain to you guys how this works. I come to you, let's say I'm the atheist, you're the Christian, and I come to you and I say, Christian, tell me this, why do you reject Thor? Tell me the reasons why you reject Thor. And I start to say things like, well, there's no evidence for Thor. And then you say, haha, and that's why I reject Christianity.
And that's valid. I mean, I'd rephrase it to say insufficient evidence rather than no evidence, because just as I'm sure you'd use the Bible as evidence for Christianity, someone who believes in a literal Thor could use lightning as evidence for Thor. Like, yeah, we know it's an electric discharge, but it's a discharge that's governed by Thor. Remember, science explains the how, Thor explains the why.
And then I say, well, why do you reject Hinduism? You say, well, because they don't have any sort of real revelation from God. And I say, ha, and that's why I reject Christianity.
Well, A Hindu might take issue with that, responding by saying that Hinduism is about self-realization rather than revelation, where one must have a personal experience with the truth set out in the Vedas and other sacred texts and teachings, and Christianity offers no equivalent to that, thus making Hinduism the superior religion. Christians like to cherry-pick certain aspects of their religion that they think makes it look more unique than other religions, and then pretend that those aspects are fundamental to how you would judge a religion to be true, like personal revelation from God. But a Hindu would disagree that such things are necessary to determine truth. So who is to be the arbiter here?
So I just apply whatever you say. And what's interesting about this is this: no thinking is required. What some of the differences are between, say, Hinduism, or let's take their example, Thor worship, right? Part of the whole pantheon and believing in Thor and all those different gods. What's the difference between that and Christianity? Here are a few differences that I jotted down, and I've got links in the description I'm going to share with you as well.
Just keep this section in mind as we go through it. There's a reason he went with a belief in Thor rather than Hinduism.
That let you follow up with these things. So the first one is cosmological arguments. So cosmological arguments, and by the way, let me just preface this. If you're the atheist and you're thinking, Mike, those have all been debunked. Haven't you seen rationality rules? And I'm like, yeah, I've seen it. They haven't been debunked. Like, you're still on the bottom rung, guys.
And there's some of that snark that I've been cutting out. It's not that all the cosmological arguments have been debunked. It's that when you update the cosmological arguments to take our modern understanding of physics and cosmology into account, they lose their kick, essentially getting us to a cause for the universe, but then not concluding anything about that cause. Even before Einstein came along and revolutionized our understanding of the universe, the arguments would often jump from things like necessary being to, and that being is God, without explaining why it has to be a being or why this being was God. It just is.
They haven't been debunked. Do a little more research on this, please, I beg you.
I have. When you talk to a cosmologist about the origin of the universe, they have no problem leaving God out of the equation. It's in the realm of philosophy where it's suggested that a God is necessary for the existence of the universe, and in my experience, nothing illustrates this quite like Sean Carroll's debate with William Lane Craig.
The discussion we're having tonight does not reflect a debate that is ongoing in the professional cosmology community. If you go to cosmology conferences, there's a lot of talk about the origin and nature of the universe. There is no talk about what role God might have played in bringing the universe about. It is not an idea that is taken seriously.
Also worth mentioning is that about 73% of philosophers either accept or lean towards atheism, as opposed to about the 14% who accept or lean towards theism, according to a 2009 survey. So even in the realm of philosophy, where famously you can find philosophical justification for pretty much any stance you care to hold, nearly 3/4 of philosophers either are atheist, or at the very least lean more towards atheism than theism as an adequate explanation for things. And while I'm sure that they would prickle at the word debunked to describe a philosophical argument, it seems reasonable to me to assume that these 73% of philosophers would agree that there are good reasons to not accept the cosmological arguments for God.
Because it's the derision towards Christianity that keeps you as an atheist.
Says the guy who seems to have nothing but derision for atheism. And let's also not forget here, now I understand he's not talking to all atheists, but for me personally, it was my love of Christianity that ultimately led to me becoming an atheist. Because I studied it and did a deep dive into its inner workings to figure out how I could make the things make sense, and then they didn't make sense.
You won't think deeply about it, because why should you? Because you hate it. And I know that doesn't represent everybody, but it does represent a lot of the bottom rung atheists, right?
I don't think that it does. Now, certainly there is plenty of vitriol and bad argumentation coming from the atheist side of things, but in my experience, most atheists are former Christians who stopped believing largely because they were putting more thought into Christianity than the Christians in their community, resulting in them having questions that went unanswered or inadequately answered, leading to their eventual disbelief. Now, obviously, this is not universally applicable. My experience has been shaped largely by my culture. I wouldn't expect atheists in India to be mostly former Christians, for example, as Christianity isn't the majority religion in India. But this has been my experience here, and this experience holds true even for the person who wrote the blog that you're responding to. On another blog, he has a post explaining why he's no longer religious, and it basically boils down to several questions which his family and pastors were either unable to answer, or to which the answers were less than satisfactory. So really, the fact that such bottom-rung arguments, as you call them, could work at all on someone who is in a heavily Christian environment is an indictment against Christianity.
Well, there's cosmological arguments, and there's plural. There's a bunch of these, but one example is the Kalam cosmological argument. By the way, the Kalam cosmological argument, or cosmological arguments in general, they don't work for Thor.
And this is the reason I think he went with Thor instead of Hinduism. Because Thor isn't a creator god, so of course the question of what created the universe doesn't work for Thor. Odin, however, did create the universe out of the dead body of the father of the frost giants, so it does work for Odin. It also works for Hinduism. There are several creation stories in Hinduism, and it's stressed that these are not meant to be strictly literal, but one element that is common in several of them is that Vishnu had a lotus flower grow out of his navel, from which emerges Brahma, who then creates the world. Essentially, any religion that has a creation story can use any of the cosmological arguments. And that's part of the weakness of the argument. It doesn't get us to a specific god, it just gets us to a creator. The Kalam in particular, though, doesn't even get us to God as the creator, it just gets us to a sufficient cause, which then leaves the door open for this cause to be natural rather than supernatural. It also assumes a beginning for the universe, which is not something that is certain at this time. And there are several cosmological models that do not have a beginning as would be required by the cosmological argument. Though, interestingly, the bouncing cosmology model that I've made reference to in the past, where our universe is one in an infinite series, with each universe having slightly different properties than the one before it, fits very nicely with the Hindu idea that the universe is created not once, but infinitely, over and over again, with Brahma creating and Shiva destroying.
So this is a legitimate reason why I can reject Thor, but embrace monotheism.
Okay, but why do you reject polytheism? There's nothing about polytheism that says one of those gods couldn't have created the universe. And why do you also reject the monotheism of Islam, Judaism, or Sikhism? You pivoting to a god from a polytheistic pantheon who is not regarded as the creator god, while ignoring the fact that this exact pantheon does have a creation story, does not explain why the cosmological argument precludes that pantheon. In fact, it seems more like a bottom-rung apologist attempt at avoiding the question altogether.
Teleological arguments. This is arguments from design, and you could go two different branches on the teleological side. This is to say biology shows evidence of design and intention, and this is whether or not you believe in evolution.
So, what was the intention of the muscles surrounding the human ear, which actively try to rotate the ears towards sounds, but are too weak to actually do so? That doesn't seem like good design to me. And really, if you believe in evolution, what design are you even seeing? At best, God designed us through a process that involves massive amounts of suffering. And the fact that you had to throw a bone to the science-denying portion of your audience really speaks volumes here. Even apologists who accept evolution seem willing to court anti-scientific bullshit if it means keeping their view counts high. Either that, or Mike here is anti-evolution, but he's willing to court the more scientifically minded Christians in order to keep the view count high. Honestly, I have way more respect for apologists who take a firm stance on evolution, either for or against, than I do for the ones who waffle about it for fear of offending part of their base.
You can also run the argument through the laws of physics and through the constants and qualities that we have in the universe itself. The teleology doesn't work for Thor, but it works for God.
Again, it doesn't work for Thor, specifically because Thor is not believed by anyone to be the god that created anything. But it would work for any god that is thought to be a creator. At least in as much as it works at all. Personally, I don't find the teleological argument to be even the slightest bit compelling. To say that the properties of the universe are fine-tuned for life is to presuppose that the kind of life that we are familiar with is the only kind that is possible. It also assumes that the properties of the universe could have been something other than they are, which is unknown at this point. And it assumes that our universe is the only one to ever have existed, because if it's possible for other universes to exist before, after, or even simultaneously to ours, and it's also possible for the properties of these universes to be different than ours, then we would only ever expect to find life like ours in a universe like ours. And so it is entirely unremarkable that life like ours evolved in a universe like ours. There's also the fact that an omnipotent God shouldn't need to fine-tune the universe for anything. God can do as he pleases. What does it matter if the strong and weak nuclear forces are such that it would not allow for life? God can make life anyway and sustain it himself. In fact, that would be much better evidence for a God. If we studied the universe and found that everything about it suggested that life should not be possible, and yet here we are impossibly existing, that's great evidence for a God. But that's not what we find. we find that when we study the universe, the kind of life that we are familiar with is entirely possible within it, given the right local conditions. Also, going back to your distinction about how the biological argument supposedly works whether or not you believe in evolution, this version of it most definitely does not, because the whole premise is that our universe is favorable to the development and evolution of life. If God created everything without evolution, then what does it matter if the laws of physics are such that stars can last long enough to fuse the elements that life requires? God would just make whatever elements he needs right then and there.
Moral arguments that God is the grounding for objective moral values and duties. I have a whole playlist of videos by one of my favorite guys, Dr. William Lane Craig.
William Lane Craig, also known as Low Bar Bill.
I thought to myself, and I'm not kidding, I thought, if there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing. And so my attitude toward this is just the opposite of Kyle's. Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it.
That's right, one of the most highly regarded Christian apologists flat out states that he lowered his epistemic bar in order to believe the thing that he wanted to believe, which kinda speaks to the whole point of the "I just believe in one less God than you" statement. Why does Christianity get a lower epistemic bar, but other religions have to have a higher one? Craig explains that it's basically because he emotionally connected with the idea that God would personally love him, and that by following the religion, he could spend an eternity with such a being. But Christianity is not the only religion with that message, and that's also not something that everyone will emotionally connect with. So if we set our emotions aside, why does Christianity get a lower epistemic bar? There is no good reason for it, and despite your pivoting to a non-creator God in order to claim that generic arguments don't work for non-Christian gods, they often do.
Yes. Now this is where a lot of atheists go, Mike, when you say moral argument for God, what you're really saying is atheists are immoral. I'm not saying that. Christians are never saying that.
Christians are never saying that? I've personally had Christians in my comments say exactly that. But more to the point, the Bible itself says that. Psalm 14 opens by saying, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they do abominable deeds. There is none who does good." Christians often quote the first half of that verse to explain why atheism is foolish, but then these same Christians will turn around and say, as you have here, that atheists can be good people, and usually follow that up by saying that they do that by borrowing from the Christian worldview. Well, the Christian worldview, according to the Bible, should be that atheists cannot be good people. And not just that they will be superficially good but evil in their core, but that they do not do good. There are no atheists who do good deeds. So the fact that I have raised tens of thousands of dollars for my local food bank over the last few years is impossible according to the Bible. And Mike disagreeing with the statement means that he disagrees with the Bible.
But this is the constant, I've had this conversation lots of times. Hey, how do you account for moral values and duties? You're saying I'm immoral, I'm a good person. I'm not saying that. I hate you.
I'd just like to point out that, aside from Mike making it look like he's jerking off a couple of dicks here, this segment where he's making up shit that he claims that atheists would say is in the same video where he says this later on.
Religious people will say, now look at this. I love when people predict how others would respond.
This is why, in my videos, I generally avoid pontificating on what apologists would or would not say, unless I have clips or articles to back up what I'm saying about it. And when I am guilty of it without having specific examples to back me up, such as earlier when I said that I've had Christians in my comments say that atheists are all evil, bad people, I point out that it's people in the comments section, a place known for its bad takes and lack of nuance. And while I can't, in this specific instance today, point to a real comment saying that, because I get thousands of comments and I wouldn't even know what keywords to begin searching for that wouldn't also catch thousands of comments that don't say that, I can point to the verse in the Bible that says that, which I think is actually way more damning.
Actually, I would argue that you are a moral person, maybe not good, but you're at least a moral person, and that is the evidence that we're presenting for God.
What is the distinction between being a good person and being a moral person? This seems like Christian doublespeak to account for their whole everybody is really a horrible person whose horribleness rises to a level where they deserve to be tortured for all eternity because of it, while still acknowledging that the vast majority of people will never do anything even close to something that could justify such a punishment in their lifetime. You might be a moral person who does good things, but every time you get angry, that's just as bad as killing the person that you're angry with. So if you've ever been angry at a category of people, then that's the moral equivalent of committing genocide. Of course, you're still a moral person, so you would never act on that, but thinking it makes you a bad person who deserves hell, because having that thought is just as bad as acting on it. Oh, yeah, and also you didn't even have to have the thought that you'd like to kill them all. The emotion of anger is the moral equivalent to having had that thought. So even if your actual thoughts were more along the lines of, I wish they'd change their mind about that thing, you were angry, so it's just as bad as killing them. I'm gonna have to put that on a list of 10 more things that don't make sense about Christianity for my follow-up to the first one.
At any rate, God can account for this because he is the necessary being. Thor cannot account for this because you can't ground those morals in the person of Thor the way you can with God.
What does it mean exactly to ground your morals in the person of God? Different people have different opinions on morality, so clearly we don't all get our morality from some consistent source. And if we are supposed to get our morality from God, then how do we actually determine that God's morality is actually moral? Why is God automatically the arbiter of what is right and what is wrong? What's more here, you want morality to be objective, but to be objective, it has to not be dependent on a subject. To say that God is the source of morality is merely to swap humans for God as the subject. To be truly objective, morality would have to be independent of God. Saying that morality is grounded in the person of God just strikes me as a lazy way of not even thinking about what morality really is, why we have morality, what's the best way to determine moral behavior, etc., etc. It just answers those questions with God, assumes that that is an answer that is both correct and sufficient, and then hand-waves away the fact that humans disagree about morality all the time with an appeal to the fall. If I say something is moral that you personally agree with, then that's morality that's grounded in God. But if I say something is moral that you disagree with, then the only reason we're even capable of thinking that's moral is because humans are fallen creatures who have been corrupted. Christians who agree that God is the source of morality can't even all agree on morality. Catholics argue that morality points to God in much the same way as Mike does, but there are entire Christian denominations that don't just disagree with the Catholic Church on moral stances, but think that the whole institution is evil, with several claiming that the Church itself is the beast of Revelation. Two groups of people who claim to get their morality from the same source, and yet they don't agree on morality. How is this even possible if God really is the source of morality?
So Thor fails the Euthyphro dilemma, whereas God passes it with flying colors.
Whoa, hold up there, Sparky. You didn't explain how God passes it. You just asserted that morality is grounded in God, and then moved on. The Euthyphro dilemma is, put simply, the question of whether something is morally good because God says so, or if God says it's morally good because it's good on its own merits. And yes, the apologetic response to the Euthyphro dilemma is to say that it's good because God's nature is good, but that's a distinction without a difference. Effectively, it's falling back to the first point. It's morally good because God says so. But even if I grant this, it still leaves us with a problem. How do we mere humans determine what is morally good or bad? Well, since we're fallen enough that we can have moral disagreements with other humans despite all of us having the same moral code written on our hearts, we'd have to then compare our moral opinions and actions with God's nature, which is functionally impossible as God does not make his nature available to us for comparison. The Bible certainly doesn't do that, unless you want to say that slavery is moral according to God's nature, because the Bible explicitly endorses slavery, or that genocides can at least sometimes be moral according to God's nature, as he not only commands genocide multiple times, but once committed the most thorough genocide in history, if we believe the story of Noah's Ark. There's also the interesting fact that research has shown that what someone estimates about God's beliefs on social and ethical issues is mostly determined by what they already believe about that same issue themselves. And in cases where a believer had their mind changed through the course of the study, they reported that God agreed with their new stance. So human beliefs about God's moral opinions match up with their beliefs about their own moral opinions, and when they change their mind about a moral belief, they then correspondingly update their opinion about God's moral beliefs. And it doesn't matter what the specific belief is, this is pretty universal. Given that believers all seem to be under the impression that God fully agrees with them about morality, but that believers frequently have mutually exclusive moral beliefs when compared with each other, how is anyone to say what is really moral or immoral with God as the measuring stick? The measuring stick always seems to line up perfectly with whomever is claiming that it's there in the moment, despite the fact that these people will disagree with other people who also claim to have that same stick. So even if I agree that morality is grounded in God's nature, that still doesn't help us figure out what morality actually is, because by all appearances, God has not made his nature available to us for any sort of moral comparison. And so we're back at secular morality, where most people appeal to a form of consequentialism. And that includes people like Mike here. He does a decent job of pretending like his position is divine command theory, where an action that we might consider to be evil if committed or commanded by God is good purely because God is the one committing or commanding that act.
I'm not going to defend God. I'm going to say whatever God does is right. Whatever he chooses to do is right, including killing people.
But even he, at times, slips back into consequentialism when it comes to justifying God's actions that we might find unpalatable.
But what about there's people caught up in those judgments that seem to be innocent, in which case, in my own mind, there's a couple things that I would at least try to work through. One is the possibility that that sometimes, in some scenarios, it might be morally justifiable to even kill an innocent person in a greater context. And so, like, if a plane is hijacked and we know that plane's going to be driven into whatever building with thousands of people in it, and we shoot it down, we do so with grief and with sorrow, but we do so justifiably.
That is not morality from God's nature. That is consequentialism. If we don't shoot down the plane, thousands of people may die. If we do, dozens of people will die. Dozens is less than thousands, so the consequences, while still bad, are less bad than if we do not shoot it down. Mike doesn't compare the action of shooting it down or the inaction of allowing it to continue with God's nature. He calculated that the consequences would be worse if it was not shot down than if it is, and then decided on the course of action that had better consequences in his personal subjective opinion.
The resurrection of Jesus is an argument that works for Christianity, doesn't work for Thor, right? Historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. It doesn't work for Thor.
I mean, obviously, but I don't see how the people who believe in Thor would see that as an issue. Hell, in the polytheistic worldview, there are even reasons to believe that Jesus really did come back from the dead, but is not actually the Christian God. He could have been resurrected by a trickster god. He could have been resurrected by a god who thought that the development of a religion around him would benefit their own objectives. He could be a god, just not the god that Christians believe him to be. The possibilities are endless here. And that's if I grant that there is good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus in the first place, which, in my opinion, there is not.
Number 8, prophecy. Prophecy shows that Scripture is inspired by God, that he predicts things ahead of time and then later they come to pass.
If the Bible were written all in one go, and it was verifiably completed before its prophecies were fulfilled, and the prophecies were specific enough to unequivocally be able to tell when they were fulfilled, then you might have a case. But as it stands, the fulfilled prophecies in the Bible seem to be written exclusively by people who were writing later than the prophecies were being made, and had access to those prophecies after the fact, and so could massage their stories to make them fit. So, for example, when the Gospels explicitly state that things happened so that the prophecies may be fulfilled, like Matthew 2:17, 2:23, 4:14, 13:14, 26:54 through 56, 27:9, Mark 14:49, Luke 4:21, 22:37, 24:44, John 12:38, 13:18, 15:25, 17:12, and 19:36, to name a few. That shows that the authors of those books had knowledge of the various prophecies and were actively trying to tie them to parts of Jesus' life, sometimes to ridiculous effect. Like where Matthew 21:7 has Jesus riding 2 donkeys into Jerusalem in order to fulfill a prophecy from Zechariah 9:9, where it says, "Your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Matthew made sure to cover his bases by having Jesus ride both a donkey and a colt at the same time, as only having him on one animal could potentially leave the door open for this prophecy to remain unfulfilled. So when you have authors writing stories of events decades after they would have happened, who were not themselves eyewitnesses to the events, as scholars almost unanimously agree the gospel authors were not, then see them connecting events in the narrative to prophecies that were written hundreds of years before, is not really surprising or impressive. People do that sort of thing with prophecies all the time, and biblical prophecies were often quite vague in their wording, so whether or not they would have been fulfilled is a matter of much interpretation. Even between the Gospels, we see that Mark, Luke, and John seem to consider one colt to be enough to fulfill the riding on a donkey prophecy, but Matthew disagreed, adding in the second donkey. And when the Bible does get specific, the prophecies often fail. Like the one about how Tyre, a city that still exists to this day, would be conquered and destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, never to be rebuilt. And while Nebuchadnezzar did lay siege to it and eventually made Tyre a vassal state of Babylon after 13 years of siege, he didn't destroy it, and it's still there today. And then later in that same book, there's a similar prophecy against Egypt. First, that God would make all of Egypt a desolate waste for 40 years, to the extent that no man or beast shall even set foot in it during that time period. And then after the 40 years are up, it will be a lowly kingdom that will be conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. And while you could say that maybe the prophecy against Tyre was a bit hyperbolic, the fact that Nebuchadnezzar won that siege is enough to fulfill it, it remains a fact that there is no evidence at all, historical or archaeological, to suggest that Egypt once spent nearly half a century as a completely uninhabited wasteland, and Nebuchadnezzar never even came close to conquering it. So yeah, the biblical prophecies that have been fulfilled were done so in a way that could be easily contrived by later authors just being familiar with the earlier prophecies, and there are plenty of failed prophecies in the Bible, demonstrating a rather startling lack of prophetic accuracy from a book that's supposed to be the Word of God.
Now, if you think, well, that's just the Bible proving the Bible, you're on the bottom rung.
No, it's not the Bible proving the Bible. It's later authors were aware of prophecies, and so wrote their books in ways that would fulfill these prophecies, which I guess could be oversimplified to using the Bible to prove the Bible, but that's an oversimplification that I try to avoid because it lacks a bunch of nuance.
No, it's documents from history that cover massive amounts of time written by different authors, and we can actually separate the prophetic foretelling from the fulfillment that we can confirm through outside sources. Okay, that becomes something very different than the Bible proving the Bible.
What prophecies do you think were confirmed as fulfilled through outside sources, I wonder? And do you have to assume that a book was written earlier than it was in order to get you there? In fact, there are times when the dates for the composition of biblical texts are arrived at least partially, based on how accurate or inaccurate the prophecies are. Daniel, for instance, gets the general outlines of things mostly correct when dealing with events in the 6th century BCE, the time when it was supposed to have been written according to the text itself. But there are significant errors that would be understandable for an ancient author writing a few centuries after the fact, but are strange coming from someone who lived through that time period, like getting the order of ruling monarchs wrong, their lineages, and even potentially inserting a completely non-existent figure into the mix. But then when prophesying about events that would take place around the 2nd century BCE, 400 years later than it was supposed to have been written, it suddenly becomes significantly more specific and is accurate in its specificity. Until a point where the predictions are just flat out wrong. This suggests that the book was written sometime around the 2nd century BCE. It makes sense that someone writing then would have a general but limited knowledge of events from 400 years previously, and then the author was able to write in much more specific terms about his own time, but when actually attempting to predict the future, he failed just as anyone guessing about events would be expected to. So yeah, in this case, you could say that a number of prophecies from Daniel were confirmed as fulfilled through outside sources. But there are several prophecies in that same book that are confirmed to have been inaccurate through outside sources, and the nature of these accuracies and inaccuracies is a part of how scholars figured out that Daniel was likely written in the 2nd century BCE rather than the 6th.
Muhammad had prophesied that in the future, or in the end times, dishes would speak to one another. Now, the idea is, well, this is satellite dishes. This is a prophecy about satellite dishes. Now, I try to have consistent standards. If I saw that prophecy in the Bible, I would never use it because I would say, why on earth would I have thought at the time that this could refer to satellite dishes?
I've seen the kinds of things that apologists will latch onto as fulfilled prophecy. Hell, you yourself quoted Genesis 3:15 as being a prophecy that speaks of Jesus.
The very first prophecy of the Messiah, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15.
It's not even clear that this verse was written as a prophecy. It seems to be written more as an etiology. It's a part of a story to explain a fact about the world. The fact that it's explaining is why snakes bite people while people try to kill snakes. It's because of the curse of God. Because the snake tricked Eve into eating the fruit, God cursed the snake, saying that he will put enmity between the snake and the woman, with the offspring of the snake biting at the heels of the offspring of the woman, while they try to kill the snake by bashing their heads. But you take that verse and contort it to make it appear to be a prophecy about Jesus, with Jesus being an offspring of the woman through his human lineage, who will defeat Satan by crushing his head, thus offering salvation to humanity. But if the snake is supposed to be Satan, and this verse is supposed to be a prophecy, then what of verse 14, where God is cursing the snake as compared to the other animals, without even giving so much a hint as to its demonic nature? It's not cursed above all the other angels and demons, it's cursed above all livestock and beasts of the field. How does that fit into the prophecy? And if it doesn't, why does it get ignored? So yeah, given that these are the sorts of prophecies that you're willing to accept, forgive me for not believing that you wouldn't use the dish one if it was in the Bible.
This seems to be a modern use of a word that didn't have that ancient use. This is called anachronism, reading into the past something that was never there in the first place.
And what's the issue with that? It's a prophecy, is it not? If accurate prophecy were a thing, would we not expect to find the occasional anachronism, where the prophecy was referring to something which would not have been something that the author could have known about in their time? Hell, your use of Genesis 3:15 as a prophecy referring to Jesus is itself anachronistic. The author of that text himself would not have known about Jesus or Christianity, and there doesn't appear to be any messianic interpretation of that verse outside of Christians anachronistically imposing the interpretation of Jesus onto it. From the organization Jews for Judaism, quote, "There is absolutely no reason to assume that Genesis 3:15 is messianic or that the Messiah is to be born in a supernatural way. The phrase 'her seed' has nothing to do with the determination of messianic lineage. The woman mentioned is Eve. Her seed is representative of all her future descendants, and the direct reference here is to the hostility between mankind and serpents. There's also the fact that, in the Christian interpretation, the seed of the woman is referring to a specific descendant of hers, while the seed of the serpent is referring to the same serpent who is being spoken to in the passage, not its descendants. Unless Christians believe that the serpent wasn't actually Satan, but was actually one of Satan's ancestors? That would certainly be a weird interpretation that I hadn't heard before, but I've never heard that before."
Well, as you read more and more about Muhammad, you realize he thought that birds could talk to people. He said Solomon had conversations with birds.
And if you read about Jesus, you find that he thought that mustard seeds are the smallest of all seeds, and that they grow up into big trees, neither of which are true.
Editing Rhino here. Yeah, not sure how I missed this during the script writing and recording processes, but yeah, it's kind of amusing to me that he's complaining that Muslims think that birds literally spoke to Solomon, when he's from a religion that believes that snakes spoke to Eve and donkeys spoke to Balaam. There's also the fact that some species of birds actually can speak. I am not aware of any species of donkey or snake that can talk, so really the Muslim claim here is the more believable of the three. Although, to be fair, Islam would accept the other two claims as well because, they believe in the Old Testament too.
He said that Alexander the Great traveled to the edge of the earth where the sun fell into a pool of mud, and there he met a group of people that lived on the edge of the earth where the sun went into the mud.
And in Joshua 10, 12, and 13, the Bible records that the sun stood still at Gibeon and the moon in the valley of Ajalon, thus giving the Israelites more daylight hours during which they could defeat their enemies. The most charitable interpretation here is that the earth suddenly stopped spinning, and God performed one of the biggest miracles of history by stopping the catastrophic destruction that would result from such a sudden stop, and that this massive miracle only gets a passing 5-sentence reference that doesn't even make it clear that such a big miracle took place. But more realistically, the ancient authors of the Book of Joshua didn't know that the Earth is a large oblate spheroid rotating at 1,600 kilometers per hour, while also orbiting the significantly larger Sun, but thought that the Sun was a small, fairly close object that moves through the sky, as is the Moon, and so stopping the Sun would only have the consequence of making the day last longer.
Number 9, I'll have for one that people don't appreciate very much, and they should. Personal experience. Now, I have experienced God in my life. I don't usually offer that as evidence for you, but it's at least evidence for me.
I mean, sure, I'll grant that it counts as evidence for you, but if you're not offering it as evidence for me, then why are you not only presenting it here as though it is evidence, but also saying that people don't appreciate this one very much, but that they should? Why should I appreciate your personal experience when you acknowledge that your experience doesn't even count as evidence for me?
The fact that I have all this evidence for Christianity, this is number 10, is evidence against Thor.
Well, most of the evidence you gave would work for Norse pantheism as well if we don't specifically just narrow it down to Thor, and some even work better for Norse pantheism than Christianity. Many of the problems with the Christian God stem from how powerful Christians claim he is, things like the problem of evil. These problems go away if there's a whole pantheon of less powerful gods. Why is there evil and suffering? Because the gods that want to prevent it can't be everywhere at once, and there are other equally powerful gods who want to cause chaos and destruction, that's why.
Is evidenced against Hinduism, Buddhism, and even atheism.
Not really. How does the cosmological argument not work for Hinduism? All it gets us to is a cause for the universe, and in Hinduism, that cause is Brahma. There are many different flavors of Buddhism, but one common thought among many of them is that the origin of the cosmos is not a question that should be answered with religion. To quote the Buddhist monk K. Sri Dhammananda, The explanation of the origin of the universe is not the concern of religion. Such theorizing is not necessary for living a righteous way of life and for shaping our future life. However, if one insists on studying this subject, then one must investigate the sciences, astronomy, geology, biology, and anthropology. These sciences can offer more reliable and tested information on this subject than can be supplied by any religion. So, yeah, I guess you could technically say that this means that the cosmological argument doesn't work for Buddhism, but given that I'm not convinced that it works for any religion, that doesn't really matter to me.
Right? Evidence for one religion is evidence against competing claims.
Yeah, if it's specific enough, but a lot of the evidence you gave for Christianity wasn't actually specific to Christianity. You just assumed that it was, and moved on with zero justification aside from your personal incredulity. I mean, yeah, there were those bits that I cut out where he links to the hours and hours of other content he has on various subjects, so presumably there will be specifics there, but honestly, the level he's at now seems to be pretty normal for apologists in my experience.
So the phrase that we often hear online, we often hear repeated by skeptics and cynics, that there is no evidence for God, there's no evidence for the Bible, no evidence for Christianity. It's not only not true, but it reveals something, and this might change our approach to those people. It reveals that they have such a shallow understanding of the evidence for God, of the evidence for Christianity, that they are in this incredibly confident state where they feel they can dismissively say that none of it exists.
Either that, or they're just not being explicit in their language, because in my experience, no evidence is usually shorthand for no evidence that I find to be compelling. I agree that there is evidence, but I find it to be incredibly weak compared to what I would expect if the God that is described by the Bible actually existed. Just as you find the dishes talking to each other to be insufficient evidence to convince you of the truth of Islam, I find the fact that stories from the 1st century were written in a way that made them seem to fulfill prophecies written hundreds of years earlier, which the authors of the 1st century stories definitely had access to be insufficient to convince me of the truth of Christianity.
The most popular level of atheism, pop atheism, really does think that none of these evidences exist, or that random YouTubers have utterly refuted them with their 5-minute videos.
You know, I made that dig about Mike bragging about how many hours of content he has on various topics as a fairly minor joke that doesn't matter at all, but I'm beginning to think that apologists might really value quantity over quality. Between him digging at another YouTuber for only making a 5-minute video on it, his bragging about the length of his content, Habermas bragging for years about how many hundreds and thousands of pages he's writing on his minimal facts argument, and how frequently apologists will talk about how high the pile would be if you put all the biblical manuscripts we have in one stack, it's hard not to draw that conclusion. If it only takes 5 minutes for someone to explain why they don't find an argument or a piece of evidence compelling, then why is that a problem? Would my position suddenly become more tenable in your eyes if I point out that my videos have gotten so long recently that a couple weeks ago I referred to a half-hour-long video as being on the shorter side, and then point to a playlist that I may have that has hours and hours of content of me explaining why various religious arguments aren't convincing to me, which run the gamut from the young Earth creationism of the likes of Ray Comfort and Matt Powell, to the old Earth creationism of Frank Turek, to the Catholicism of Brian Holdsworth and Father Casey, to the pop apologetics of J. Warner Wallace and Mike Winger? Yes, Mike, I consider you to be in the bottom rung pop apologetics category, despite the considerable length of your content. You speak with such derision of the random YouTubers making 5-minute videos refuting arguments for God, but you yourself are basically just a random YouTuber doing the exact same thing, just with longer videos and in the other direction. As far as I can see, you are no more qualified to speak on these subjects than I am. Both of us have the exact same credentials here. We are ordained ministers, and nothing more. The YouTubing is essentially a hobby that grew into a career. So now it's literally my job to research these topics as thoroughly as I can, and then break them down into language that is more easily digestible for people who don't want or have time to dig through all the materials for themselves. But you won't catch me throwing shade at other people for being YouTubers as though I think I'm better than that for some reason. I have done it a couple times, but that always comes with a self-deprecating jab because I know what I am. Also, I got curious at this point about what rationality rules video on the Kalam he was talking about, and he did publish a video that's a little over 5 minutes that did talk about the Kalam cosmological argument just a few months before Mike published this video, and what I find interesting here is that Mike presented it as though it was supposed to be seen by atheists as a thorough and complete destruction of the argument, rendering the whole thing moot. But that's not what it is, not by a long shot. It's an explanation as to why he doesn't think that the Kalam version of the argument is compatible with libertarian free will, and he even explicitly says at the end of his video that he doesn't think this is the end of the Kalam.
This isn't some haymaker against the Kalam or libertarianism, but so far as I can tell, it is a haymaker against those who insist on the soundness of both.
So this random YouTuber, who's the only one you singled out by name, so I assume that this is what you're talking about, would completely disagree with you saying that he thinks he has utterly refuted this argument in his short little video. And you being dismissive while misrepresenting the other side makes you look like you don't actually have a good response to the other side. Now, sure, the people who only watch your videos aren't likely to notice that that's what you're doing, but anyone in your audience who is curious about what rationality rules could have said in such a short video that's supposed to have utterly refuted the Kalam argument, and so goes to his video to see what all the fuss is about, is going to see that it's not even close to being what you claim it to be. They will then be less inclined to trust you in the future, and I can definitely see how that could plant the seeds of doubt that will result in them losing their faith. My own first seed of doubt was way less significant than a popular apologist being caught misrepresenting the other side. It'd be like that proverbial pebble in their shoe. They're still Christian and still watching apologetics content, but now every time you come up, they'll have this nagging feeling that you might be misrepresenting the positions that you're arguing against, because they've seen it happen before. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying here is, go ahead and keep setting up the straw men for you to knock down. You'll make more atheists that way than if you're honestly engaging in the conversation. Good work!
Realize there's more to think about here than what you've realized. You had an unthinking Christianity, and then you went and moved to an unthinking atheism through slogans and bad reasoning. And I think that represents a large number of people.
You guys are a bunch of thoughtless chumps. That's why you should come back to Christianity. Do you really think that being condescending is going to reach anyone? That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Maxine Stabile, who says, "You do realize chiropractic does help with back and neck pain, right? I have back and neck pain and chiropractic helps. I would appreciate you not lie about things you don't use. Just because you don't go to a chiropractor doesn't mean it doesn't help people." This was on a video where I made a one-off joke about chiropractic that essentially conflated it with astrology. I didn't talk about it in the video itself, but I did include a link in the description to an article on science-based medicine that provides a brief overview of what chiropractic is, its origin, and a plethora of links to other information that point out the problems with chiropractic. Basically, it began as something that is entirely pseudoscientific. D.D. Palmer adjusted the spine of a deaf man in 1895. Supposedly that adjustment cured his deafness, and from this, Palmer concluded that spinal manipulation could basically cure anything. And thus chiropractic was born. Today there's an internal conflict among practitioners, with some who keep to the more scientific, manipulating the spine can make the spine feel better side of things, and others who see themselves as primary care doctors, essentially. They say that chiropractic can replace vaccination, you can use it to treat all sorts of completely unrelated issues, and essentially they carry on with the original pseudoscientific nonsense. Yes, there is some evidence to suggest that spinal manipulation is roughly equally effective for back pain as standard therapy, but it's not better. And the cost is about equivalent usually. So if it helps you with your pain, then that's fine. But I'd recommend going to see a physiotherapist rather than a chiropractor, as they can, and often do, provide similar spinal manipulation, but are significantly less likely to be quacks who think that back cracking will prevent the measles. Now, I appreciate the feedback and definitely want to know if I'm wrong about something, but please don't accuse me of lying. I consider that to be a very serious charge indeed, and I myself avoid accusing others of lying unless there is overwhelming evidence, as is the case for Matt Powell. Even here, where I said that Mike is misrepresenting the atheist content creators, I wouldn't say that he's lying about it. He probably watched the video and that is honestly what he got out of it, despite it being demonstrably wrong. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to go to aura.com/ViceRhino to start your 2-week free trial. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern, and with my partner every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Mac, and all the rest, who are the prophets predicting the future of my channel. If you'd like to write today that I'll hit 10,000 subscribers in September of 2017, and then have apologists for my channel claim that you wrote that in 2013, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Okay, that one didn't really fit the formula properly, but I still like it, so I'm using it. You can also support the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! This is a waste of space on my SD card. I should stop recording, but I'm too lazy. Avoid the equestrian altogether. Avoid the equestrian. The equestrians in Equestria.
How do you account for moral values and duties? You're saying I'm immoral, I'm a good person. I'm not saying that. I hate you.
No, sir. I didn't see you playing with your dolls again. Good.